every sector of the economy is using AI or is planning to use AI in some fashion.
Given the fast pace of development related to AI, various governments, organizations are rushing to develop frameworks related to AI. And also at the, not just at national level, but multilateral level, there are efforts. You have the GPA effort, you have the Bletchley conference that took place. There's also something happening in the framework of the United Nations, the G7. So how do you assess these processes playing out? And from the perspective of industry, is there a need for an interoperable set of legal frameworks? Is that necessary or need not hinder whatever innovation the industry is looking at?
You probably won't be surprised that I think it's absolutely essential that we have interoperable standards at a global level. And it's fairly obvious that this is a transporter medium, and regulations around safety that are developed in one jurisdiction are going to affect the safety for people in another jurisdiction. In that sense, it's sort of like climate issues and sustainability issues. It's hard to do anything here in a vacuum that doesn't affect the rest of the world. So globally interoperable standards, I think, are really important, and I think it's appropriate to focus, at least as a foundation, on high-level principles. Get some basic agreement on both what we want to agree that these technologies should do and things that we should be careful of. So a lot of fora for this. I think the OECD principles were reinforced by the Hiroshima G7, and I think those need to be internationalized in either the UN or the OECD or multiple fora and discussed. I mean, they may also need to be iterated because this needs to be, I think, globally interoperable.
Mm-hmm. In all this debate that is happening, how do you see the China factor playing out? Because the governance framework in China is different. The kind of entities who are active or maybe in the lead in terms of AI, very often state-owned entities and don't have the same considerations as the private sector. So the debate related to China, and they have made a lot of progress in AI, they are part of some of the multilateral conversations and not part of others. So how do you see that challenge playing out for industry perspective?
The geopolitics of it is probably your area of expertise more than mine, Ambassador. But I think the UK Safety Summit, China participated in that. There was some controversy on whether they should. I think it's actually a good thing that they're brought into the conversation at the end of the day, because we are all what they're going to do is going to affect the rest of the world, and vice versa. It's not to say that that jurisdictions need to be able to support their sovereign interests and protect their users, and there's going to be a lot of state issues that that different jurisdictions will be concerned about. But there's no doubt China, if you look at the pace and quality of the artificial intelligence work that's happening in China, there's various ways to look at that. One of the ways is to look at the quality of peer-reviewed publications that they're putting out. I think the U.S. is number one, China's number two. They're right there. So they're going to have an impact, and so I think the conversation between governments is a good one to have.
One of the criticisms that is often put out is that by all this talk of norms, regulations, an attempt is also possible of regulatory capture by the bigger players in the system, Google, Microsoft, and others. Do you see that as a genuine challenge?
Well, first and foremost, particularly with the frontier models, these safety issues that I think that we sort of have leaned into, we've said governments need to be in charge of the trajectory of these. They need to be aware of the capabilities of highly capable frontier model large language platforms, and responsible for ensuring that there is some way to ensure safety. That's the government's job. We have a role to play to make sure that we're providing the kind of transparency and accountability to inform that. But it's the government that at the end of the day that's going to have to make that decision. But it's also not governments and industry as the binary piece here. This has to be NGOs, civil society, academics. Everyone is going to have a role to play. It's always a danger of some sort of capture when any entity is regulated. I think one of the benefits of having, I think, what's going to be a multilateral governance system here with different kinds of ways of looking at different parts of the technology stack will be that there'll be a lot of redundancy and a lot of different parts of the ecosystem that will be tasked with looking at some of the safety issues and regulatory issues. So I think it'll be just a much bigger conversation than technology and governments, which is going to be a good thing at the end of the day.
Well, it's been suggested that the technology related to AI is not fully understood, and it is also moving very fast, and in any discussion and norms and regulations will always be doing a catch-up and not fully there. How do you see this tension being handled?
You know, well, another real learning that we had from the design of our principles was it's really important to have principles that are durable. So if we can agree on the principles and they can be durable and stand up to different tests of time and iterations of technology, that will have a more lasting stickiness than having to rethink principles or regulations, you know, every year. So a way I think about manifesting that is, you know, they should be high level, they should be objective oriented. And so an example is a principle, for instance, around ensuring that roads are safe, rather than a global conversation of how the car should be designed or a motorbike should be designed. We should have those goals, and then, you know, different jurisdictions and different organizations can look at the tactics depending on relative to the technology and how to get there. But I think if we have those sort of high-level principles, they'll be durable, and then putting in the work on the front end to get global consensus around that will be one that will last. Obviously, it will kick the tires on those. It's appropriate to do so. We should do so, but I think having those principles at a high level, which I think we're off to a good start, I think will give us a chance of greater success, that they'll last.
It's also been suggested that rather than profit or revenue generation, technology should also be a force for global good. And therefore, the work that Google is doing in India, do you see potential there for Google partnering with India to take societal benefits from AI-related technology to other countries in Africa, Latin America, elsewhere, broadly now being described as a global south?
We have partnerships with the Indian government. We're really excited about this because, one, India is going to be they're going to be a global leader on AI, and they're going to influence not just the global south, but they're going to influence the world, and rightly so. So some of the things that we are partnering with the government and testing out here in India are already being used in other parts of the world. So we have AI technology that has enabled us to do very, very good flood forecasting. So the standard technology had been about 2 days to be able to forecast a flood. The AI technology that we've developed moves that to about 10 to 12 days before the flood, which turns out to be a major difference in saving people's lives, that extra 8 days. We have a goal to have 100 different Indian languages interoperable with each other, instantaneously translatable, multimodal. We have 24 Indian languages right now. The training that our large language models are doing on that project are going to help us translate other global languages. So very excited about the work that we're doing here in India. We're going to build upon that work. We have a big commitment to this country, but it's going to benefit the rest of the world.
Well, I want to thank you, Malcolm, for your time. Clearly, it's a time of a lot of tension, a lot of opportunity, people struggling to keep up with the technology development. But good luck to you as you make the effort to make technology work for larger societal benefit, not just in one country, but across the globe. So thank you.
Ambassador, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for this interesting session. We request you to please join us for the photo op, if you can join us, sir. Thank you so much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now we have a very special message from Eva Madel. She is member European Parliament. Can we have the video, please? The message is on digital transformation. Let's see.
Dear participants in the Global Technology Summit, it's a pleasure to be here with you today during such an exciting moment for global AI governance. I'm very grateful for the invitation to Carnegie, India, and the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, and also to them for organizing this summit. It's unfortunate, but due to the ongoing negotiations on the European AI Act here in Brussels, I could not join you in person, but I hope to be able to do so at the next occasion. I wanted to use the opportunity to start by summarizing what the European Union's planned AI law set out to be, how it is changing, and what I hope for it to become. So first, what we set out to be is that the AI Act was released back in 2021. That is, of course, way before all the ChatGPT hype. The Act is the world's first ever general law on AI. It is horizontal, meaning it covers all sectors. It utilizes a so-called pyramid approach ranging from prohibited practices to low-risk practices, which do not need to be regulated. Of particular interest is the high-risk category, which regulates risky use cases such as biometric facial recognition, topics related to migration or credit assessment in employment or education. So that's about the first part. When it comes to the second part, how the AI Act is changing, I have to say that when the initial law was presented back in 2021, we had not seen many of the breakthroughs that we are seeing today. And with the AI race heating up, we have seen the debate around foundational models and generative AI intensify. And this is why we responded by introducing new text that is addressing these challenges. Thirdly, I want to share what my hopes are for the Act. We're in the midst of the final negotiations of this law, aiming to conclude it in the next couple of weeks or months. When it comes to innovation, to adequate guardrails and international collaboration, I have to say that this has been at the heart of my work on the AI Act. I want a law that delivers for both citizens and the creators and innovators trying to advance in this space. I have to underline that the European AI Act is far from being the only AI rulebook in town, as you all know. At first sight, the recent news do not sound very promising for the possibility of a global democracy-minded AI pact. But what we've seen is that from the White House executive order to the G7 codes of conduct to the UK AI summit, there's one thing that's clear. And this is that world leaders are trying to get ahead on AI and show they're in control. Many have painted these developments as some sort of a striking divergence between the EU and the rest. The EU going for the binding regulatory approach and the rest of the world opting for voluntary measures. But I don't think the picture is so black and white, and I think we can still avoid regulatory fragmentation. What I aim to do is that I acknowledge that there are differences in governance philosophies and technological priorities, but yet I see some convergence among democracies. And let me point out three concrete areas. First, when it comes to underlying values, the EU AI Act promises many of the same principles as the Niti Aayog proposed. For instance, when it comes to safety, to equality, privacy, transparency, these are all featured in both approaches. Secondly, when it comes to foundational models, the UK AI Summit, the G7 Codes of Conduct, and also the White House Executive Order all focus on the most powerful AI models. And as you all know, we are also in the midst of the discussions on foundational models. And as Parliament, we have pushed for an approach that focuses on these powerful foundational models. Thirdly, I think it's very important to support innovation, and we have put several concrete measures in the AI Act that aim to boost innovation, which can also be seen with and in the White House Executive Order. I'm putting all this out there in this some sort of a constructive way, as I would like to say that what the EU is doing is not diametrically opposed to what other democracies are doing. I think it's complementary. And I think global democratic allies need to work together on the development, on the application, and governance of leading edge technology like AI. And in the next 18 months, democracies face the perfect storm. We have several elections in key jurisdictions, such as India, the US, the EU. We're faced with multiple theaters of war, disinformation, but also struggling economies. And I think this is the moment to ramp up our cooperation with India and other key partners. And I'm very much looking forward to stay in touch with many of you going forward in order for us to work on those points and to facilitate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva, for sharing your thoughts on innovations in technology with us. Ladies and gentlemen, now we move on with our panel discussion that is on intelligent regulation of AI, the way ahead. So joining us for this panel discussion, we have amongst us Rahul Matthan, partner Trilegal. Can we have you here? Hello, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have amongst us Michael Sellitto, Head of Global Affairs, Anthropic Adjunct Senior Fellow, Center for New American Security. Melinda Claybaugh, Director of Privacy and Data Policy, Meta. Marcus Bartley John, Senior Director, Asia Government and Regulatory Affairs, Microsoft. Johanna Weaver, Founding Director, Tech Policy Design Center, Australian National University. We have amongst us Raluca Sernatoni, Fellow Carnegie Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, she'll be joining us virtually. Our moderator for this session is Amlan Mohanty, non-resident scholar, Carnegie, India. Over to you, sir. So can we have a big round of applause for our panelists, please? Thank you.
Everyone, and thank you for being with us, and thank you again to all of the speakers on this panel for joining us today. We're going to stick with this theme that I think Eva set the context on very clearly. Regulation of AI is a hot topic at the moment, and we want to, I think, in this conversation, dissect a few and unpack a few things relating to AI regulation. I think the first thing that's clearly evident over the last few days of conversations here is that we are seeing different approaches to regulation around the world, right? Whether that's in the US, which is a combination of voluntary commitments and safety and testing reporting requirements through the executive order, to in the EU, which is much more rules-based, to what we just heard from the Minister of State for India, for IT, which is a hybrid framework, which is a combination of markets-based interventions and rights-based regulation. What we're also seeing, I think, and what we want to do in this conversation is the importance of regulatory choices, right, in developing this regulatory framework. And I'd love to get the panel's opinion on what the trade-offs are, what the accountability measures might be, and how this might impact the larger technology ecosystem as we think through our regulatory frameworks. Another, I think, key outcome we want to get out of this panel is to focus on a very specific issue that's come up over the last few days, which is this question of how privacy risk management plays into the larger conversation around global AI regulation and domestic approaches to AI regulation. I'm going to skip over all of the introductions, but you can refer to your profile, to the briefing packet for specific introductions. But what I do want to comment on is the fact that I'm very excited for this conversation. We're in this panel represented across the AI stack, from Anthropic, which is a foundational model provider, to Microsoft, which operates across the AI stack, including compute, as well as providers of applications, including Meta. We also represented, we have multi-stakeholder representation, including through academia and people who advise on legal and policy development. So I'm really excited for this conversation. I hope you are too. We're going to try and keep this conversation free-flowing, but Johanna, if I can start with you on this question of regulatory design choices. I think what we heard from Eva and over the last few days is that there seems to be some consensus on principles, right? And while that is an evolving process around norms building, we feel like this idea of promoting innovation, balancing that with safety risks, promoting interoperability seem to be principles that governments around the world agree on. If I can ask you, with all of your experience thinking about tech policy design, how do we translate some of these principles into specific regulations? Is that as hard a challenge as it is? And is that particularly difficult for AI regulation, and why?
Thank you. Look, I think the most important thing when we're talking about the regulation of AI is, first of all, to acknowledge right up front that we're not operating in a vacuum, that the existing legal frameworks that operate in our legal systems already apply to artificial intelligence. Now, that seems like a really obvious point to make, but I think it's often forgotten. And then when we come to the way that we regulate artificial intelligence, I make three main points. The first one is to say that if we're going to do regulation effectively, we need to bring nuance to the conversation. So we need to be clear, are we talking about the regulation of application artificial intelligence that is already pervasive throughout our economies? Are we talking about foundational models, which are powerful models that provide the foundation for many other bodies of work that sit on top of it? Or are we talking about the really powerful foundational models or frontier models? Because when you're looking at the regulatory frameworks and the design of the regulatory frameworks, it does actually make a big difference depending on the type of artificial intelligence that you're talking about. So bringing that nuance is really very important. I think it's also important when we're talking about the regulation of artificial intelligence, you touched in your intro on the different approaches that we see. So the US market-based approach, the UK, the EU, thank you, rights-based approach. We can't forget the China state-based approach. Many people have spoken about the Bletchley Park Declaration, the G7 Declaration, the work that has come. The Chinese have been doing a lot of work, including their International Global Compact around artificial intelligence. We need to make sure that we're taking that into account. And the final thing I would say when we're talking about the regulation of artificial intelligence, and I touched on this last night in my session, that we need to be recognizing that for the Global South, much of the conversation in this space has been about the opportunity of artificial intelligence. That's the awakening that has happened in the Global South in the last year. For the Global North, most of the conversation has been around the risks around artificial intelligence. If we don't recognize that difference and that we don't bring a nuanced conversation and recognize the very real opportunities that the Global South are wanting to embrace artificial intelligence and engage in a way that allows us to do that safely, from a geopolitical point, to go to the theme of the summit, then we will be giving a gift to China.
Thanks, Johanna. I want to come to you, Michael, perhaps for the first point that Johanna mentioned, which is this question of what to regulate. And I know you're in the spotlight on this conversation, definitely in the EU, where there is an evolving conversation about how foundational models like Anthropic should be regulated. And I also want to get to the third point Johanna mentioned about the geopolitical impact of that. So if you can maybe take us through your thinking about how foundational models you believe should be regulated, whether there are frameworks that exist that you think countries around the world could use in thinking about foundational models, and two, what the trade-offs are in trying to regulate foundational models. We know now that the EU's conversation on foundational models has been evolving, and perhaps there's a rethink about the potential competition impact of over-regulating foundational models and the ability of LLMs to compete in the global market. But what are also the larger security, innovation, larger strategic geopolitical impact of perhaps over-regulating foundational models or under-regulating foundational models?
Well, thanks. Thanks, and it's great to be here. As you can imagine, with a job like mine in 2023, I'm at a lot of conferences these days, and this has definitely been one of the better ones. I think the quality of the conversation and dialogue and the participants has been really strong, and I'll try not to lower the bar too much. It's really going to be an interesting day in the EU. The sort of potential final trilogue is happening, and we may have some announcement. Maybe Raluca can predict what's going to happen for us. Anthropic is an AI safety and research company, and we're focused on both the potential tremendous benefits the technology is going to bring, but we're also one of the organizations that's concerned about the potential catastrophic risks of the technology. And so our approach is really to conduct empirical technical research and publish that to try to make AI safe, and also to engage with policymakers to help them understand where the technology is, where it's going, so we can create policy frameworks that incentivize and prioritize safety while also maximally benefiting adoption. I think the world has been really, surprised by the pace of change of the technology over the last year. I'm sure at last year's GTS there was not this focus on large language models, but for folks that have been working in the field for a while, this moment was predictable in the sense that we've known for a long time, several years now, that as you scale up model size, you get more capabilities pretty much across the board. And some of those capabilities are good areas that maximize productivity or help sort of address societal issues, and some may be in areas that are ripe for misuse, right? Terrorist groups might be able to misuse models to help learn how to produce bioweapons or produce harm at a particular significance. And so the way that Anthropic has been thinking about this is what we've developed a policy that we call a responsible scaling policy. And it's a series of technical measures and internal policies that help us identify and manage catastrophic risks related to the technology in the areas of misuse or autonomy of the systems. And we've defined a risk-based system that gates our development and deployment of the technology based on testing, evaluation, and security measures. So we call these AI safety levels, and they're sort of loosely based on the biosecurity level system that you have with biological labs, where the more dangerous the pathogen, the more rigorous and significant the security measures need to be. So, in areas where the technology is low risk or it's safe, deploy it, get the benefits. In areas where there might be higher risks, test. If it's not safe, make it safe before you release it. And so, we talk about taking this flexible approach, and part of the reason why we published this responsible scaling policy, and I'm here at events like this, and we talked a lot to other companies and governments about it, was we really want to start a conversation about whether these kinds of risk-based approaches can be initially measures for self-regulation, but ultimately for governments to be, putting into actual, regulatory requirements for more powerful systems. Just another couple quick points here. I know we've got a lot of content in a short time. One of the questions here is, are there risks of under or over-regulation? Well, the risk of under-regulation is you might miss out on the opportunity to prevent serious harm. How might we have designed cybersecurity protocols for the internet differently if the risk of hacking was seen at the outset? Or if we had seen at the outset how social media could be used for disinformation, what would we have done differently? So let's think more upfront about the consequential impacts of the technology. But overregulation is also a problem. Johanna mentioned just now and last night, for those of you who are still up at 9:30 p.m., the difference between the global north risk-based concern of catastrophic risks and global south trying to adopt the technology. And I don't think we need to bifurcate things, right? We can be sort of flexible in our approach and risk-informed. I think there's also, to just get at the geopolitical point briefly, and then I'll stop, there's also a risk of fragmentation here. Right now, the way the technology is developed, there's very, large, expensive models that are being produced by a handful of companies, that might cost in the next year or two on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you have countries taking very different regulatory approaches that make it so that these models can't be deployed to users, to businesses within their borders, you may end up seeing really significant economic, trade, even geopolitical or geosecurity implications of countries that have sort of chosen to cut themselves off from the most advanced aspects of the technology. So I think it's really important that we cooperate and look at things like the G7 Code of Conduct and other international frameworks like that as a basis for how we get cooperation across sort of like-minded countries on these issues to make sure that we're all sort of among the like-minded community benefiting from the technology.
Thanks, Michael. Marcus, I'm going to come to you in just a minute. I want to come to you on the point Michael made about fragmentation and how that might impact a global business. But before that, Raluca, thank you for joining us virtually. Appreciate it. I do want to get your perspective on what Michael said, right? And given your experience covering the EU regulatory approach, could you tell us a little bit about what the motivation was for policymakers in the EU to adopt this rules-based, risk-based approach that's also rights-based approach, and to codify this in the regulation, which seems to be a unique way to approach AI governance domestically. And perhaps if you could also tell us a little bit about where that conversation is headed for, right, and where the trilogue is at, and if you would like to respond to anything specifically Michael said. Really trying to get a perspective on how other countries around the world can look to EU potentially as a model, and what potential design choices we can try and adapt from that.
Great, thank you. I hope you can hear me. I see that you can see me. Greetings from The Hague, and I'm sorry not to be there. I'm actually also heading to a conference that I'm organizing here in The Hague. About your question, yes, it's a very good question. It's related to the EU's approach in regulating AI. And of course, it's based on this desire to balance both innovation and the potential benefits of AI. But as Johanna mentioned, also the protection of fundamental rights and values. And I would say that there are several factors that actually influence the EU's decision towards a risk-based, rules-based, hard regulatory regime. And I will list a couple of them. First of all, ethical considerations. The EU places a very strong emphasis on ethical considerations when it comes to AI. There are concerns about the impact of AI on fundamental rights, as I mentioned, such as privacy, especially non-discrimination, and also autonomy. So a rules-based framework will help establish clear ethical guidelines to ensure that AI systems are developed and used responsibly. A second reason for a hard rules-based regulatory regime are transparency and accountability. The EU prioritizes transparency and accountability in AI systems, and this would require actually developers to adhere to very specific standards, disclose information about their aims, and also be accountable for the outcomes of AI applications. Then another reason would be risk mitigation. I will not go into more details on this. Another, I think, very, very important reason is more the internal market regulatory approach, and especially and very importantly, harmonization across member states for the regulatory regime. The EU actually often seeks to harmonize regulations across these member states to also ensure a level playing field, also for businesses, and a consistent actually protection of individuals. So a rules-based approach would contribute to harmonization. Of course, it's very important to note that AI systems engender high conversations about public trust. So building and maintaining public trust is also AI crucial for AI systems is also crucial here in Europe. And finally, I would say the reason for a more harder regulatory framework would also be the first mover approach and global leadership. And speaking about geopolitics, the EU aims to become a global leader and first mover in setting standards for emerging technologies, the so-called Brussels effect. However, as Michael actually started to reach this topic as well, now the EU AI Act is facing some major problems. There are some key questions related also how the EU AI Act value chain, the fact that there might be questions regarding, let's say, a strong expert-based institution with authority to keep the regulation up to date, whether the regulation is flexible, future-proof. As already mentioned, the EU AI Act is being subjected to trilogues. These are talks between the EU Council, the Parliament, the European Commission, yes, trilogues are these informal tripartite meetings on legislative proposals between representatives from the three institutions. And the aim is to reach a provisional agreement on a text that is acceptable to both the Council and the Parliament. And today, indeed, the AI Act on December 6th is undergoing the fifth and supposedly final round of trilogue talks, before it can hopefully be finalized by the 27 member states under the Spanish presidency and by the end of this year. Well, it's already late. Lawmakers still disagree on major points. Huge issues remain unsolved, from police use of AI to foundation models, as you mentioned. And there is a big risk that negotiations will announce actually that a deal has been reached, when in fact it has not. There have been some oppositions, of course. I can go into more details. From the biggest EU member states, France, Germany, and Italy, and they voiced actually fears about a section of the proposed AI Act that governs foundation models. Also, the new regulation has faced some roadblocks when it comes to real-time biometric identification on public accessible places, barring, of course, a few exceptions, and many member states want to use it for internal security reasons. But on foundation models, this has been actually the sticking point in this late phase in the negotiations. And the three countries propose that AI companies working on foundation models regulate themselves by publishing certain information about their models and signing up to codes of conduct. There is also some fear regarding the first mover advantage being lost. We see lots of initiatives and what I call an emerging regime complex of both soft and hard regulatory initiative. And yes, the EU needs to really reach an agreement this December under the outgoing Spanish presidency, because looking forward to next year, there might be also some big hurdles, for instance, with the new elections coming for the European Parliament in June 2024. But maybe I stop here and follow up later on with further details. Thank you.
Thank you, Raluca. I really appreciate those insights from the EU. Johanna and Michael, I'm going to come back to you on some of what Raluca said in the context of business impact, which is what I want to switch gears to right away. So if you can just hold your thoughts on potential conversations on risk classification and business impact. But Marcus, if I can come to you. Microsoft's a global company. You operate in several different jurisdictions, closely tracking AI regulation around the world. Obviously, I want to ask you a question about how regulatory fragmentation might impact a company as yours, but also all of your downstream partners, right? You work with system integrators, with application developers, right? It's an entire ecosystem that would have to deal with this issue. But if I can ask you perhaps a leading question, which is what leads to regulatory fragmentation? And perhaps, and this is my personal view, is a difference in understanding of technical architectures around the world, right? And perhaps there are some governments that have more advanced thinking about how the AI stack actually operates compared to perhaps other jurisdictions, right? So perhaps the question that I'm asking you is, are you worried about regulatory fragmentation? And is a difference in how different governments appreciate and understand technical complexity involved with AI systems a reason for that fragmentation?
Great, fantastic. So you said we've got 2 minutes each, and there's 4 questions I counted there, so I'm going to have to be pretty economical. But look, I mean, I think maybe I'll flip it. I think sort of to start with why fragmentation matters. Look, obviously, a company like Microsoft and other global tech companies in our industry, we care if there are completely divergent approaches taken globally. But I think, as you alluded to, ultimately, I really think the main impact is on those organisations, whether it's governments, businesses, non-profits, or individuals that are using our technologies. Most of the impact is actually going to accrue to them at the end of the day if we end up with radically different regulatory approaches. And I think there's probably sort of 3 implications that I want to touch on. I think the first is, look, one of the things that has been incredibly exciting, I think, for all of us this year is looking at how rapidly some of the cutting-edge AI innovations have diffused globally. And so we've seen, right at the start of this year, we've seen developers in Silicon Valley and, in the UK and everywhere in between excited about this, but we've seen developers in India and Indonesia also getting their hands on some of this technology and using it. I think one of the consequences of regulatory fragmentation is you slow down that pace of diffusion. And you slow down the ability of taking great ideas from countries like India and spreading that elsewhere in the world. So I think there's sort of one potential negative impact in terms of the diffusion of good ideas, particularly across the global south. I think there's also an impact for smaller players. A country like India that has a vibrant tech ecosystem, a vibrant startup ecosystem, if we start to see wildly different approaches across the world, that's going to have a negative impact on the ability of those startups to plan ahead, to invest, to attract capital. If you can't convince your investors that you're going to have some regulatory certainty 1 to 2 years down the line, that's going to have an impact on the ability to grow over time. So I think the startup SME impact is real. And then I think the third reason why it really matters is if we're going to take a shared approach, at least across many countries in the world, to preventing some of the harms that we're concerned about from AI, we really need to do that collectively, not individually. And look, there's a very live debate in many countries about the potential for AI to exacerbate some of the impact of cyber foreign influence operations, for example, and the potential to interfere in democratic processes. If countries don't get together and talk about some of the partnerships that are going to be necessary to combat a problem like that, we're going to be in a worse place. You know, we're going to compromise our ability to defend against some of those harms. So I think there's plenty of good reasons why we need to get together and sort of address some of that. Now, I've answered one of your 4 questions, but
Yeah, maybe just if you can take another minute to respond to maybe one other point, which is what's the solution to that, right? And
Yeah, sure.
perhaps what we might be thinking about is a larger conversation on a global framework on AI, and perhaps that works downstream to help harmonize these different approaches. But maybe I can ask you also about standard setting bodies, right? And I think they do play an important role in harmonizing, providing technical standards, benchmarking, right? Things that we've been talking about over the last few days. One is, do you think there's a role for standard setting bodies in harmonizing these different approaches? And 2, do you think they're adequately represented in the conversation we're having right now? For example, they're not represented on this panel.
yeah, no, look, I think it's a great follow-up. Thanks. I need an AI co-pilot to help me remember things, obviously. But look, I think I'm actually optimistic about the potential that we'll be able to address some of these fragmentation challenges. And one of the main reasons is, look, over the last 12 months, I've been in a lot of countries around the region in close contact with, our team that sits in Brussels and DC and elsewhere. And I think it's striking that we're getting a lot of the same questions, a lot of the same concerns from governments, from civil society, from societies in general about how do we ensure AI, as capability grows, is safe? How do we ensure there's the right security measures? How do we ensure that, the integrity of democratic processes is protected? So I think we're starting with really a shared base of concern and questions from many countries. And then I think, look, what's the way forward? I think it's a good point to take those principles and common set of concerns and get practical. Let's break this down. What's for each layer of the AI tech stack, of the infrastructure layer, the models layer, the applications layer? What are some of the practical regulatory measures that are going to snap to each layer of the technology stack? How can we build on some of the standards conversations that are having? There's great work happening in the International Standards Organization to do things like developing common taxonomies around what AI systems are, what bias means in an AI system. We've got to harness some of that effort. We've got practical efforts that are happening between pairs of countries like Singapore and the US. The standard setting bodies releasing a crosswalk of what the 2 different standards relating to AI governance mean in each country. There's real practical work that can be done. So I think let's build on the common principles and concerns, get practical, use some of the standard setting bodies, and finally, build on what we've got already. We've got some good progress that's happened in the G7 this year. There's active discussions in the UN. There's some good work that's happened in the OECD. No one of these groups has the solution, and that's appropriate, but let's build on what we've got.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Melinda, Rahul, I'm going to come to you on the privacy questions as the privacy experts on this panel. But just before that, Johanna, Michael, I was struck by something that you said earlier about risk frameworks, right? And listening to Raluca talk about the EU's motivation for its regulatory approach, I couldn't help but agree with everything she was saying, right? Clear ethical guidelines, need to protect user rights, all sounds fair. But having dealt with this, Johanna, from a design perspective, Michael, having dealt with this from a business perspective, is there a need for a more nuanced conversation, Johanna, as you said, about risk classification? We've seen the model in the EU, right, about how a different tiered risk framework. But as you said, Michael, not all foundational models are high risk. Not all uses are high risk. And perhaps there needs to be a middle ground, like you said, Johanna, more nuanced conversation. So Johanna, quickly, I know we have only a couple of minutes on this theme, but in a minute or a half, and Michael, I'll come to you as well.
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about a risk-based model, the first thing I would say on that is risk is an inherent calculation of probability. And these models are operating, the really advanced frontier models, are operating in a way that it is impossible to predict. Therefore, the risk-based model at that level, I think, is fundamentally flawed. We need to have a different model, and I'm one of the strong proponents of looking at controls for those frontier models in a more traditional sense. So that's for the frontier models. When it comes to the more benign foundation models and application level artificial intelligence, then I think a risk-based model makes a lot more sense. But we're also seeing in the EU many of the challenges that emerge from not having nuanced categories around risk-based approaches. Here, I think we have the answer in our existing legal frameworks. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. The fundamental principles of bias, discrimination, ensuring that we have strong competition, the principles that exist now in existing legal systems will serve us well. What we need to do is translate them so that they can operate at speed and scale. I also think the concept of harmonization when it comes to artificial intelligence is a concept that we need to let go of. I think what we need to focus on is interoperability, not harmonization. And I would really challenge India in this respect to step up. India has such a unique perspective to offer here in the sense that you combine all of what Anna Bradford refers to as the 3 different regulatory models. So the state-based from China, the rights-based from the EU, and the US market. India combines all 3 of those in a way that is incredibly powerful and can position yourselves to be a real leader in this space. And so I think there's an enormous opportunity there.
Thanks, Johanna. Michael, I'll come to you, maybe add a little bit more of a nuance to my question to you. So we've seen the EU model for risk-based approach, and again, going back to what you said about the need to have a more nuanced conversation about risk-based classifications of foundational models and above that stack. I suppose my question around this is going back to what she said about interoperability, right? A key outcome of the Bletchley Declaration was to try and have a shared understanding of risk, right? And perhaps we're still having that conversation. Do you think we'll ever get to that shared understanding of risk, given cultural differences and several other aspects around the world? And if we can't have that harmonized point of view, how are we going to facilitate interoperability when it comes to the risk question?
Well, I think one way is to focus regulation on outcomes that you want as opposed to inputs. So a lot of the previous discussion around regulating AI was focused on, well, we need to regulate what data goes into it. We need to look at on the input side of things. And I think ultimately people care about outcomes, right? People care not about the exact sort of mix of rubber that goes into tires in a car. They want to buy a car that's not going to crash or that's not going to injure them or their families, right? And so I think we can agree at a high level about the kinds of risks and outcomes that we don't want. And then countries can translate that into national regulations that's appropriate for their culture. I think to get at one thing that Marcus said, which is making things more concrete, is right now we just lack really good ways of measuring the capabilities and safety characteristics of the technology. And if you don't have good ways of measuring something, you can't regulate it appropriately. And so we've been investing a lot of time in trying to work as a company across industry and with governments to really increase the level of investment into measurements and evaluation techniques for these models, because that's going to be a way to develop a system that can be flexible, that can be appropriately sort of regulated, that governments will have the confidence or that have the knowledge they need to ensure that the technology is safe, and customers will have the confidence to purchase and adopt it.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. I'm going to switch themes now to privacy, and we have some experts on this panel who can take us through that conversation. Melinda, I'm going to start with you. You've worked on privacy legislation around the world. I'm going to start broad and try and then dig into some specific questions. But the broad question, how does privacy risk management fit into this larger conversation around AI regulation? What are the privacy risks that we should be concerned about? Where is the regulatory conversation going? And then I'll dig in, and Rahul, I'll bring you in as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that I was on this stage a year ago talking about privacy legislation that had just passed in India, and there's a lot of similarity in the conversation. I think the conversation around AI regulation is supercharged but it has all of the hallmarks that those who have been in the privacy regulation space for years will recognize. And so because of that, I think there's a lot that we can borrow from that space as we're thinking about AI regulation. So a few things to consider. First of all, the privacy regulation coalesced over many, many years in a shared understanding, a consensus around principles, things that go into privacy regulation, and that is, we're starting to see that in the AI regulation space, but we're still very early stages. Some other hallmarks of privacy regulation are around technology neutral regulation. So here we need to be careful not to regulate the technology, but regulate the uses that I think fellow panelists have been talking about on stage. There's also a concept in privacy regulation of a risk-based focus, right? So that's why you see things in privacy regulation around high-risk uses or sensitive data being regulated more carefully than other uses and types of data. There's also a focus in privacy regulation on differentiation of roles. So you see the processor-controller distinction, or in India, the data fiduciary-processor distinction. And I think that is a really key element that we have to keep in mind as we're talking about AI regulation. And I think not enough attention has been paid to that. I know, for example, there are thoughts around that in the G7 Code of Conduct, for example, but to really dig in into that differentiation of roles between developers and deployers and users, and who's accountable for what. It's not going to work to say everyone's accountable for everything. That's not a realistic reflection of how AI is developed and deployed. And so I would love to see more clarity brought to that question, and I think that is the clarity and certainty that is going to be critical to provide businesses the comfort and certainty to get into this space. And then I think finally, you were talking about risk management. I think that is a really embedded concept in privacy regulation, that there are internal accountability privacy programs where you identify risks, assess them, mitigate them, and most importantly, that you show your work and show your progress and are able to provide that transparency and accountability to regulators. So I think that is a known muscle in companies, and I think we should harness that, right? We don't need to reinvent the wheel in AI regulation. Let's build on top of that muscle and those processes that companies already have in place. And so that said, I think that there's a lot to build on in the privacy space, but there's a lot of new stuff. And so I think that will not be kind of known or already addressed by privacy regulation. And I think that's really where we need to focus our efforts on what is net new in this AI space, because we're in a very, very complicated regulatory landscape, much more than we were. When did the GDPR come out? 2016, 2018. Countries, although there are some similarities in approaches to data and tech regulation across the world, there's a lot of difference. And so it's not going to work to have a one-size-fits-all model for AI regulation. And so the work is going to be finding the gaps, finding what is already covered. We already have extensive legal regimes around privacy and data, around copyright, trademark, around bias, fairness in employment, credit, housing, education, health. We have all of these regulatory sectors. The work is going to be to see how AI impacts all of those regimes and those sectors and adapt them to be fit for purpose. Now, there may be some very kind of a narrow tranche of stuff that we're talking around frontier and AI risk, and that should absolutely be dealt with. But there's a lot of work that can already be done in terms of making existing regulatory frameworks fit for purpose and providing the clarity that folks in the AI ecosystem are desperate to have so they can innovate.
Thanks, Melinda. I'm going to come back to you actually on some of those points. But you did say something that I'm going to come to you, Rahul, on, which is, I think the big takeaway for me is that there are some existing lessons from the discourse we've been having on privacy legislation that we can apply to AI regulation. But she did also say there could be some differences and gaps, right? And I wanted to come to you on that, Rahul. And this is something that I've been thinking about, is that when it comes to AI, one lens is to obviously use the privacy lens. But when we look at larger LLMs, for example, a lot of the data is not personal data. It's anonymized data, it's de-identified data, right? It's data that would not be within the scope of what Melinda was talking about, which is privacy legislation, right? And someone who's worked on these issues in India, and where India perhaps has been in advanced stages of these conversations around what they call non-personal data regulation. Right? How do you see that conversation fitting into this conversation we're having right now about AI regulation and governance?
So, thanks, Amlan. And if you don't mind, I'll come to the answer in a circuitous way. And I want to start with what Johanna said yesterday, that I'm really glad that she repeated today, and I think others have underscored on the panel, which is that, as much as you say there are many different binaries with AI, there's one very important binary, and that is between the global north and the global south. And the global north, and I'm sorry, these are all companies, so they have to say certain things, and I'm not bound by those constraints. I'm not going to say any of those things. The global north is concerned about risks. They're concerned about the thing that they have created, which could now turn back and bite them and eat them up and destroy all of humanity and civilization. The global south sees this and says, we have many problems to solve. This is a huge opportunity for us to solve it. And so the way the global north thinks about the question that we're discussing and the way the global south thinks about the question we're discussing is very different. The global north is thinking about regulation to prevent harm. The global south is thinking about regulation to enable benefit. And I'm going to use that lens to answer the question. Because as Melinda said, all of privacy regulation from GDPR and from every other country in the world has been around what are the risks, what are the ways in which we hold people accountable, what are the things you have to do such that you don't violate our privacy. India's data protection law and a lot of the discussion around the techno-legal infrastructure that we've built over the last decade or so has been how do we use data for empowerment. And central to that is the issue of non-personal data. And in that, and I know people say that non-personal data is a very Indian topic. Yeah, we christened it. We called it non-personal data. But non-personal data is the opposite of personal data. And all the companies on the table have actually used anonymization, pseudonymization, de-identification as a way to actually, without violating laws, use data. And that's perfectly fine. And in fact, we should do it. And so if you take that lens and turn it to AI, yes, of course, a lot of the data that AI is using is non-personal data. A lot of it is not. And my worry really is that we've built these wonderful engines, we've built these wonderful machines. I am worried that having built them, we're going to pull the ladder up and not allow the global south to take advantage of what has been created. I'm completely mindful of the risks and the harms. I've watched Terminator 1, 2, and 3. I've also watched the series. But I think we've got to take all of that with a pinch of salt. I don't believe the foundation models, and I know there's two different views in the world. I don't think the foundation models that we talk about are really the Skynet future that we've been promised. They're autocomplete on steroids as far as I'm concerned. And I think that if we can't allow regulatory frameworks, we don't create regulatory frameworks that allow us to take advantage of this, we're doing ourselves a disservice. So everyone else on the panel has been globetrotting, speaking to various conferences in various contexts. I have not. I've stayed in Bangalore and I've spoken to a lot of developers in India that are just besides themselves with the opportunity. India has 22 official languages. We have 3,000 dialects. As much as we can build digital public infrastructure, there is a last mile we will not reach because you cannot build digital public infrastructure to teach people, to allow people to understand that which we are giving them. AI will allow us to do that. I can't see any harm in using AI to reach people, the 10 people who speak the 3,000th language of India, and do it on the fly, do it real time. India has built, using Llama, with really efficient tokenization, a language model that is really, really powerful to do these sorts of things. Now, we have to create regulatory frameworks that allow us to do this and many, many more things. We must be mindful of the risks, but we cannot be consumed by the risks. The last time we did this, I think the minister spoke about it in the morning. He spoke about the Information Technology Act. You know the first 15 sections of the Information Technology Act are how to write a digital contract. Those are the 15 sections that in the 22 years have never been used. We were afraid that we were entering a world, a digital world, and if we didn't teach people how to contract in this new world, that everything would fall apart. It didn't happen. No one uses digital signatures to sign a contract. We click, I agree. It's worked fine, courts have upheld it. I'm not saying that AI is that simplistic, but I worry that if we go down that path, we're not going to realize the opportunity that we could.
Thanks, Rahul. Raluca, I'm going to come to you on this. Johanna, do you have a quick point?
Yeah, just a quick direct addition to Rahul's point. I agree with almost everything that you just said, so plus one. In relation to the gaps which exist in the current legal frameworks with respect to AI, and picking up on something that Mike had said about that if you don't have an understanding of the risk, you can't regulate it. I think one of the areas where we really can move forward to fill a gap, which has not been raised at all, which I'd be interested on panelists' views on, is around liability. Because liability is an existing legal framework that exists to place the burden on the people that are producing a product to ensure that product is safe. So I think that is a really important, very often missing part of the conversation. And finally, Rahul, if you're in Bangalore, you don't need to go anywhere because the world is coming to you.
Okay, can I quick redirect?
All right, 30 seconds.
Yeah, 30 seconds.
Yeah.
I think we've got, and you've said it, everyone said it, we've got existing laws. We don't need to reinvent laws and call it liability for AI. Liability is liability. Yeah. Accountability is accountability. It works regardless of the new flavor of technology, and I really hate this. It's lovely for us lawyers because we can repackage existing advice, but it's not efficient. We have basic laws that address all of this. Let's not reinvent the wheel with every new technology, because this craze that we've had in the last 12 months over foundation AI, the next 12 months we're going to have something completely new, and I'm tired, quite frankly, of repackaging existing advice.
Luca, this conversation has moved from risks to enablers of opportunity. So if you can just collect your thoughts on perhaps how the EU is also thinking about enabling opportunity, right? Because I certainly don't believe EU's approach is binary. Mm-hmm. While you collect your thoughts on that, Marcus, Melinda, I do want to come back to this point about how existing regulations might apply to AI, and we've heard about privacy, we've had conversations about how this might impact labor rights, civil liberties, and so on and so forth. But just to stay with the theme of privacy, Melinda, there are some principles in existing privacy laws, for example, around purpose limitation, around collection limitation, which some people have argued is going to actually hamper AI innovation, right? Do you think, and perhaps there is a view that the GDPR, which is the holy grail of modern privacy data protection regulation, is already outdated for the AI age, right? In terms of perhaps enabling innovation and opportunity. So while privacy regulation is about data protection, do we need to think about perhaps a new framework where these principles around collection limitation, purpose limitations are reimagined to actually help advance the development of technology?
I don't know that it's a new framework that's needed, but I definitely think that clarity on an application of existing frameworks is really important. So you touched on a few issues around purpose limitation, data minimization. These are things that come up where there's potentially a tension. And so I think what is important is to provide that clarity, also potentially around legal bases, what legal basis is available for processing of data to train large language language models? To what extent are there user rights? Rahul's presenting one version of if it's anonymized and de-identified, then there's no problem. We are seeing criticisms of that, and so I think that is where there needs to be further discussion. I do think that just to take, I will pick on the GDPR because it's up for review coming in the coming months. I do think that what we've seen since the GDPR has come into practice is it looks good on paper. In practice, it has been interpreted in inconsistent and increasingly narrow ways. And so I do think that has created a lack of clarity. And so given that countries in many instances have modeled their domestic laws on frameworks like the GDPR, I think providing that clarity and considering this new age, this new AI age, when taking a fresh look at the GDPR or as countries go into reform processes of their existing laws. For example, I know the UK is very eager to reassess its data protection law in light of AI opportunities. And so I think these are the questions that we want to provide clarity on for developers who may be hampered or overwhelmed by how, or just confused by how existing frameworks are going to apply to the development of AI.
Sure. Thanks, Melinda. Marcus, quick thoughts. Existing regulations, if they were to apply to AI, is there a chance that it's going to limit innovation? Are you optimistic about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll sort of need a bit of all of the above. I think there'll be plenty of areas where existing regulation applies to AI. And I mean, the first thing is if we're big companies or small companies or individuals, it doesn't matter if we're using AI or any other technology, it has to be used in a lawful manner. And I think good luck anyone who wants to turn up in a court and say, well, it was a new technology. They're not paying their lawyers enough if that's their argument, I think, Rahul. So I think, application of existing laws to AI is a must. I do think there's a lot of work to be done with regulators in particular to understand what is new there. Even if we don't change the regulatory frameworks, what's new in the use of this technology? I've spent a lot of time with financial regulators over the last couple of years on this issue, on AI, and that's their approach. I think they're all pretty confident they don't need dramatic new sets of rules, but they do want to understand if financial institutions are using AI in new ways, how do we use existing regulatory frameworks and risk management when we're using a technology that is a little bit new? So I think there's that. I do think we've got to be open to the need for some new guardrails, though, I think. If we talk about highly capable models, and to be clear, I think that's probably none of the models that are in the market now. It's the next generation of frontier models. That may be reasonable for governments to say, we want some transparency there on the companies that are developing those highly capable models. When are they conducting a training run? What are some of the transparency on who that's being sold to? I think there's sort of some reasonable expectations there, and we may not have existing regulatory frameworks there. So I think it's going to be a mix. We've got to be practical and proportional.
Thanks, Marcus. We're almost out of time. I do want to get closing remarks from all of the panelists, so if you can just gather your thoughts around that. Raluca, I'll come to you. You've seen where this conversation's ended up. Your view on how the EU perhaps can think about promoting AI innovation, and is there, again, a model for the rest of the world in how it's thinking about regulation actually promoting innovation?
Thank you for the question. Yes, indeed, besides the regulatory initiative that we see with the EU AI Act, which actually the Commission framed as the ecosystem of trust, or creating an ecosystem of trust, the European Commission especially, but also together with member states, have been pushing forward for an ecosystem of excellence. The so-called ecosystem of excellence is indeed to coordinate on artificial intelligence in key areas, for instance, to set enabling conditions for AI development and uptake in the EU, make the EU the right base for excellence from the lab to the market. So collaboration with stakeholders, public-private partnerships on AI, data and robotics, research capacities, testing and experimentation, funding and scaling, especially leveraging the EU's funding schemes, for instance, the Horizon Europe, Digital Europe program, Recovery and Resilience Facility. Another important element here in Brussels is ensuring ensuring that AI technologies work for people. This means also talent and skills, having the right policy frameworks for upskilling, reskilling, promoting also a vision of sustainability and trustworthy when it comes to the systems, but also within the market, and collaborating very important, but especially leveraging the, let's say, the strengths of the EU in areas such as robotics. But to kind of add to this, what I see emerging are 4 actually visions related to AI in general, but also foundational models. One of them is indeed this idea of promoting progress, economic progress, and commercial interests. On the same level is also this interest of building trust, regulation, but more for the public good. So this is the second vision. And I think linked to that is also mitigating potential digital divides even across EU member states, not to mention more globally. And a third vision is this idea of economic security that also is linked to national security when it comes to foundational models. And the Commission especially is leading charge on this front because they have published a new strategy on economic security in the summer, and now they have also a list of critical technologies that are dual use and are also critical when it comes to strategic dependencies. And finally, the fourth vision is the catastrophic existential risk that was already mentioned, but mitigating or trying to match all these visions and balancing innovation and regulation at the same time is very challenging, of course, and especially now that we have this emerging regime of regulation, both codes of conduct, soft regulation, hard regulation. But at the end of the day, I would say that the US AI Act, indeed, a proposal from the global north, it's still a regulation that is very much focused on the public good. And that's why fundamental values, privacy, of course, other issues related to surveillance, but also responsibility and transparency are high on the priority agenda, without, of course, hampering innovation. I can also say why exactly the EU Act is now focusing a lot on trying to negotiate, especially with being EU member states. The concern of France and Germany, especially their champions when it comes to foundational models, is exactly in ensuring that an ecosystem of excellence in Europe is maintained, and they can also become competitors with US and US and Chinese tech counterparts. So that's another goal, innovation versus regulation. Let's see.
Thank you, Raluca. We have 6 speakers and less than 6 minutes and time for us to close. But I do want to give everybody an opportunity, maybe 45 seconds each, to just close this discussion. I know it's been a very rich discussion, but maybe if I can, again, start with the leading question, right? Perhaps to close, one area where you think regulators, policymakers need to focus more of their attention on, perhaps it's policy enablers creating opportunity, and one area where you think they're over-indexing on, perhaps they need to shift focus from. So if I can start with you, Michael.
Sure. So, one concept for areas to focus less on is in the US and UK, we have this concept of tort liability, right? If there are harms that you discover after the fact, you can sue in civil court and try to remedy that or be compensated for it. So you don't need to necessarily specify up front every possible thing that could go wrong with a very general purpose technology. There's a way to remedy it. Now, maybe there's things above the bar that are catastrophic that you might want to regulate. That's a little bit different. On the sort of positive side, where to focus more, our point at Anthropic, and I said earlier today, is evaluations. If we can develop better ways of evaluating the technology, it's going to make it easier to deploy. It's going to level the playing field so that smaller companies can compete with bigger ones by demonstrating the safety and capabilities of their models in an independent, objective way. And I think that's going to make the adoption of the technology in a way that addresses concerns of both global north and global south better.
Marcus?
Look, I actually think the conversation on every topic is important, and I think it's important that sort of we don't have silence on any one of these. I do think in terms of great opportunities, I think this sort of idea of seeding more ideas from the global south and spreading those across the global south, but also to the global north. I mean, some of the most interesting conversations I've had about AI opportunities have been in Korea and Japan, about Jugalbandi in India and the model that that presents for revolutionising citizen service delivery, particularly in an ageing population like those countries. So I just think finding ways in which we can take great ideas, spread them around the world, but do so in a way where we preserve trust from citizens and societies and ensure that the right regulatory guardrails are in place. I think there's such a rich opportunity for work there, and I think it's a fantastic opportunity for India to take a leadership role.
Melinda?
I think focusing less on jumping to hard regulation. I think we've talked about principles and we've talked about hard regulation, but there's a huge opportunity area in the middle that we're already seeing really exciting initiatives on. So for example, Singapore has started this AI Verify Foundation project, which is a testing ground for governance frameworks and software where they're partnering with companies. Meta just launched a program in the US to support the NIST risk management framework, testing it with companies. And so there's a lot of work that governments can do to get their hands dirty and get up to speed on issues and work with companies to really understand the challenges. I also think there's a lot of really exciting work going on in industry bodies. Partnership on AI has developed a synthetic media framework. So these issues are being tackled, and there's a lot of opportunity there that really should be harnessed.
Johanna?
So I think there's two things that we need to focus on more. The first is that existing law needs to be the floor, not the ceiling. And we really need to focus on defining the floor and our ambition for the ceiling. The second thing I'd say that we need to focus on more in these conversations is coordination across government. So coordination from ministers to their ministries, coordination between regulators and public servants, coordination between government and industry. It's the only way we're going to be able to address these issues. And the third thing I wanted to do is a little bit of a plug for work that my team has done, but I do this not selfishly because I think it will be of use to everyone in the room, which is if your head is spinning about trying to keep up with who's doing what on AI regulation or which country is doing what on data protection or national security, we've developed a tool which is called the Tech Policy Atlas. Just Google Tech Policy Atlas and you'll find it. It covers 72 jurisdictions across 15 different policy categories. It's incredibly powerful and constantly updated, and we've built this tool for you. So please, if you want to have a look at that, Tech Policy Atlas. Thank you.
Thanks, Johanna. Raluca, and then Rahul, you'll have the last word. Raluca?
Thank you. Just on that, trying to understand the very complex regime of regulations and codes of conduct is also very challenging for an expert. And I think that there is value here in terms of understanding the role of international organizations, the role of the private sector, indeed, in terms of a leading charge when it comes to self-regulation, codes of conduct, hard regulation. Making sense of that as well is a challenge in itself. I very much like this notion of interoperability and cooperation, and also a sort of a whole government approach when it comes to AI systems. I am someone that works a lot also on the military side and security and defense side. I heard geopolitics coming up in the conversation. I don't want to open up Pandora's box, but as these AI systems, of course, have dual use applications, this is something also to think about in terms of risk, internal security issues as well. I think that they are very, very important when it comes to fundamental values. But mostly, I think that the main takeaway for me here is the conversation related to the digital divide and the haves and have-nots. And something that is very important for me as well is in understanding the tech ecosystem rather than the AI systems themselves. So trying to understand the AI value chain, but also the material infrastructure that is needed there, the data required, and who controls all the levers of power when it comes to researching, innovating, and deploying such systems. And I think that from this perspective, government, international organizations, also the public sector, and especially the tech giants need to be very careful, especially when it comes to balancing these powers and who controls what, from material infrastructure, data, compute power to the systems themselves.
Thanks, Raluca. Rahul, time's up. 30 seconds.
Time's up. My previous intervention was perhaps optimistic. I want to take us out on a deeply pessimistic, dystopian note. I think I've always said that regulation lags technology. never more so here. We're struggling to regulate a technology that we should have done this work when the Transformer paper came out. Now is too late. So when people on the stage, particularly the companies, say that these are not the foundation models you need to worry about, it's the next generation foundation models, I get deeply concerned. I think the concern with regulation and trying any of these approaches is that the genie's out of the bottle. And once the genie's out of the bottle, it's impossible to put back. I think the best example of this is gene editing. When CRISPR came out, we all agreed that we would not touch the germline. Within a year, 2 babies had been cloned. I worry about that kind of an approach to regulating AI. I shouldn't be worried, but in some senses I'm terrified. I just think the way that humanity has pulled through nuclear détente and all the other things that could have completely pulverized us but has not, I think that's the only thing that will take us through this. I'm deeply optimistic of technology despite that very pessimistic note.
I would have let you have the last word, but on that pessimistic note, I feel like I need to do a quick summary. I'm not going to try and synthesize everything we've heard. We've had a very rich discussion. But for me, the key takeaway is, I think, more nuanced conversations about how to regulate different parts of the AI stack. I think more clarity on how existing regulations will apply to AI, more practical work about promoting interoperability, reducing fragmentation, and more focus on opportunity and enabling innovation. With that, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I certainly did. Can we please have a round of applause for the panel?
Thank you so much. We request all our panelists to please join us for the photo op. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, we have keynote address coming up. For this keynote address,